Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending the webinar on ChatGPT, the hype and the reality. I'm Yumiko Ono, and I'm an editor for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore. I want to thank INSEAD for having me today to moderate a conversation on one of the most widely discussed topics this year. It was just some months ago that we started hearing about ChatGPT, and now it seems like it's dominating every conversation in just about every industry. Not a single day goes by without seeing a flood of stories on new information on this topic. And the past day alone in the Wall Street Journal, there was a story on AI-generated fake videos that could flood the US election campaigns. Then there was a story on ChatGPT, how to use it in the classroom. And then also about chatbots that mimic the voices of celebrities and the IP issues that are arising. There was also a story on how scammers are using AI to improve their writing for phishing emails. So we've had a few months to get used to it. And now it's time to have an in-depth conversation focusing on what the business impact is, what the competition is looking like, and the risks and the regulations. So now I want to introduce the panelists. We have Theodoros Evgeniou. Theos is a professor of decision sciences and technology management at INSEAD, and also the director of the INSEAD Executive Education Program on transforming your business with AI. He's been working on machine learning and AI for the past 25 years, and he's founded a company with 3 INSEAD alums. We also have Karen Hao. Karen is a Hong Kong-based reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering China tech and society. And she was previously a senior editor for artificial intelligence at MIT Technology Review, and she worked in Silicon Valley before pursuing journalism. So we want to start off with a poll for the audience. There'll be 2 questions, and the questions are, one is about how often do you use ChatGPT at work? Is it every day, every week, occasionally, or never? There's another question there, so please click on that as well. It is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of generative AI? So there are 2 questions for the audience. Please take a crack at both of them. Okay, so we are seeing, let's see, okay. So it looks like we have an answer. Oh. Looks like, okay, so let me do the answer for the first one. How often do you use a generative AI for work? We have occasionally at about, or never, at 36-37%, followed by every week, and only a few people use it every day. Okay, so what about this next question? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the impact of generative AI? And I'm not able to see the answer for some reason. Maybe you could help me. Oh, here we go. Okay, we have, wow, this is surprising. 78% are optimistic and only 22% are pessimistic. Okay, there's so much been going on about, all these news stories about the risks and dangers of generative AI that I actually expected more people to be pessimistic. So this is going to be very interesting. All right, thank you, everyone. So now that we've done the poll, we've introduced the panelists, I want to start by asking each panelist a personal question. Personal question about you and generative AI. And Theos, I will start with you. What, do you have a personal anecdote about you and generative AI that you could share with us?
Yes, first, thank you very much, Yumiko, and it's really exciting to be here with you and also with Karen, who is somebody I've been reading for years now. And I always say when I am in an amphi, always read what Karen writes. So I follow what she's doing. Great work here. Yes, personal anecdote. Well, there is probably nothing better than getting some kind of recognition from your children. So my anecdote is when my daughter said, ChatGPT knows about you. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. And she was very proud about this. So I think ChatGPT gave me some credit in the eyes of my daughter. I didn't dare to check what ChatGPT knows about me because I prefer not to know what she knows. But that was, I left it to the positive side.
Okay. All right, you're known by ChatGPT. Thank you, Theos. And Karen, how about you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Yumiko, and thank you so much, Theos. I'm very excited to be on a panel here today too with you. I have to respond to the personal anecdote with a very similar one, except it was my parents. So, so also a very exciting day when my parents are proud of me. And my dad got really excited because he asked ChatGPT who are the top 10 AI reporters globally, and spit out my name, and he got so excited. And I rarely see my dad so excited about any articles that I write or anything else that I do. So it also earned me a lot of street cred with my parents.
The fact that ChatGPT, you were on that list, on ChatGPT's list. Oh, wow. That's great. Those are great personal anecdotes. I mean, I recently saw a bio written by ChatGPT on me, and it seemed to give me all these awards that I had never won. So I guess I wasn't impressive. The real me wasn't impressive enough for ChatGPT. It felt it had to do something to, spruce me up or something. So, all right. Before we go on though, Karen, I would love for you to take a step back and just define, I mean, we've been talking about generative AI, but what exactly is it? Could you define it for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with defining AI, and I actually prefer the term fancy statistics when thinking about the AI that we have today. So AI that we have today, which is called machine learning or deep learning, or if you've heard of the term neural networks, all of these kind of refer to the most common AI software that we have today. And what it's essentially doing, it's a really powerful pattern recognition engine. It's taking a lot of data, whether that's user data or data about our physical environment, like videos from self-driving cars. It's taking all of that and processing it, figuring out what patterns are, and then using that to make decisions. And the difference between the AI that we had before and generative AI now is that it's not just taking those patterns to make decisions, it's also reflecting those patterns back out, generating information, whether that's images, videos, text, based on the patterns that it finds. So one of the things that I often see people get a little bit confused with around what ChatGPT is actually doing. ChatGPT is not actually searching the web and synthesizing pieces of information. It's actually trying to pattern match how sentences are constructed on the internet. So when you ask about a certain topic, it's pattern matching what other words and what other sentences or paragraphs have been written about this topic that it has seen in the large data set that it's trained on. And then it's sort of regurgitating, building sentences, building paragraphs or essays based on those patterns. So that's a crash course on what generative AI is today. Okay,
great. So it's sort of the pattern part is important, right? And the fact that it's spitting it back out at you. Okay. So Theos, now I want to go to you on the business impact. So in the past few months, so many people, even in our audience, people occasionally or every week use generative AI. So what has been the impact, positive or negative impact on business that generative AI has had?
Let me structure this at 3 different levels, and I will add a 4th one that will come back later. Of course, first is the daily personal level of personal productivity, and we all know that it can help us draft faster text and documents. And actually, there are studies that show that this is indeed the case. But then that's at the individual level. Then we go to business process level, level number 2. And of course, businesses is largely a collection of processes, and we always use technology to optimize processes, make them more efficient, more effective. We've seen a lot of innovations in the space of using generative AI for marketing. There are startups around this, marketing for businesses, but interestingly, and we may come back to this later, marketing in quotes for election campaigns, which is a variation of this, where you target the message at the individual level. You ask, what should the farmer in Iowa with 3 children like to see? There you go. So the information is there, so you get it at a micro level for both elections and products. We've seen also lots of productivity increases in processes like customer support. There is a nice article that came out a few weeks back, I don't remember the date, that actually shows that generative AI can improve productivity of customer support by a double-digit factor. Interestingly, it does so by mostly improving the productivity and quality of lower skilled, less experienced customer support people. And not only this, it actually helps transfer tacit knowledge through text from the higher skilled, experienced people to the lower skilled ones. And that's very interesting because it's one of those technologies, I don't think we ever had this technology, which can actually summarize tacit knowledge of experienced people and help less experienced people to climb up the learning curve. And that's, I think, is fascinating to note.
Okay, hold on 1 second. So for the customer service, it's helping the less experienced customer service people to
more
use
so.
generative AI to help them.
Yes, so generative AI helps less experienced customer support people
Right.
than more experienced one in delivering customer
Okay.
support
All right.
effectively.
Okay, got it.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. And similarly, in content moderation and online trust and safety, which is a huge area that impacts all our lives, you can use these technologies to help users post better content online by potentially educating them. So the prompts or whatever you write you are about to post or articles can be supported by these technologies to improve the quality. And also in security, you can see applications to understand threats and detect threats in general. That's the second level, business process. Third level is, as usual in business, beyond business process, is business model and disruption. So it's fascinating to see how people at Hollywood are on strike. I had an interesting conversation with someone in a big media company, maybe it's on the audience, I don't know, who was saying that they were debating whether to support the people striking in Hollywood, developing content, or given that they are running short of content, to actually go with AI and generate content themselves. So what will this do in creative industries, including visual ones like architecture? It's interesting, and we're at the beginning of this. Now, that's the main 3 levels of business. I will just add the last one that will come back later probably. It has to do with entering new markets. And there it's more about how you enter new markets when your product or service embeds AI more broadly and generative AI specifically. There are lots of landmines there across regions, across cultures, across jurisdictions that we'll discuss later.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. So the first and second ones are helping humans to do better, right? It's the customer service, helping the less skilled human customer service people with generative AI. The third one, when the Hollywood people are on strike, you're talking about the AI doing their work for them?
Basically, well, the question is, would somebody who has, so how about getting the people who are writing the scripts, not to write scripts, but to edit generated scripts? That changes the nature of the job. How much will they get paid for this? And who owns the IP eventually? So these are challenges that we don't know how to face. And this can have an impact on their job and on the way they're incentivized. And of course, the quality of the content at the end that we all see.
So generative AI doing the actual work that humans used to do 100%, and then the humans checking that. That's the third level. And the fourth level was about entering new markets. But can you explain that a little bit more? So entering new markets, meaning AI doing all the work?
Well, the question there is, let's say that you are doing customer support or whatever, right? Based on generative AI. And the generative AI produces content that biases the communications you make with the customers, which may be potentially either illegal in some areas, and you don't even know, or against a certain cultural values. How do you manage that? You don't want to alienate your market, your clients, and your user base, because you rely on content generated by generative AI, which is potentially harmful for your brand and for the audience itself. So you have to manage that.
Okay, so the fourth one is the most dependent on AI, or AI doing most of the work. And is this a positive thing or a negative thing?
That's a good question, and I will discuss about this. Everything can be positive and can be very negative, all the way to critically negative, if not detrimental for all of us. Hopefully, people will get sensitive to this. We'll come to this later. It's a question of course, as always, how we manage it. However, before I just add a note here, everybody says that technology is a tool, like a hammer, and a hammer we can use it positively or negatively. there is something different about this technology. That's something fundamentally different about this technology. A hammer cannot affect how we think. This can affect how we think. Therefore, it can also affect how we use it. And I don't think we ever had technologies and tools before that can affect how we think and therefore how we use the tool itself and how we perform our jobs and our actions. And this is really, really important to understand and creates issues that we should discuss later.
Okay, just means that there could be so much, the implications could be so much larger because, as you say, it could affect how we think. And okay,
Exactly.
all right. So we have a whole wide range of how much it's impacting business. We have all these examples of people using a little bit to help them to all the way to depending a lot on generative AI. Now, we also have a lot of competition going on. So many companies are racing to come up with their own versions of generative AI tools. There's also the US and China competition. Karen, I want to go to you about the race between the US and China to develop generative AI. And can you discuss this a little bit? Are there geopolitical implications here, or is it just a good thing to have more competition? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, so the US and Chinese governments have been vying for leadership in AI for many years now. It's not really a new thing with generative AI. I mean, the Obama administration back in 2016 started putting out white papers about how the US should prepare to be a future leader in AI, and China then in 2017 released its own development plan for being a future leader in AI. So this has been a thing that has been happening for many years, but I think generative AI has certainly really increased the stakes because these systems, unlike the previous systems, they are a lot more resource intensive. They require a lot more data. They require a lot more computer chips. They require a lot more energy and talent to develop these types of systems. And there is sort of an active, because the US and China are in a much more explicit state of technology competition now, there are active efforts by both governments to try and make sure that they are amassing and retaining their data and their resources for their development, and also trying to prevent, exchange of talent across borders and things like that. So in October of last year, the US created these sweeping export controls that basically bars Chinese institutions, Chinese researchers from getting access to the most cutting edge AI chips, which is one of the most important ingredients for generative AI. China has also started increasingly putting more laws in place to prevent the transfer of their citizens' data outside of the country, in part also to prevent that data from being used to train AI systems. So there's just a lot of escalating tensions that are happening within this space. And it's very much tied to the idea that AI will be one of the key drivers of economic growth for both countries, military prowess for both countries, and it could also affect the national security of these countries if an adversary got their hands on this kind of powerful AI technology. So whether or not that is overblown is, I guess, beside the point, because the governments themselves are sort of reacting to this narrative and taking clear steps in turn to try and bolster their own leadership and try to be ahead in the race.
Okay, so it's quickly turning into, there's US-China tensions already, as you said, but AI has a lot to do with it now. AI is really into the tensions. And Theos, I want to also talk about competition with you. The fact that there's so many companies trying to get their hands on, to develop the next best generative AI tools. Does that have an impact on, because people are so racing ahead, does that have an impact on, somebody saying, hang on a minute, let's make sure everything is legit versus people? I mean, is there an impact there?
Yeah, great question. Let me start by doubling down on what also Karen said. I find myself increasingly in discussions where the word national security is involved as the #1 challenge when it comes to coordination, collaboration, innovation, and market expansion. This is so important. We should all just, if there is one thing to keep from this webinar, it's this word, national security. And second thing, on your point, one of them, we have to think about this regarding what are the key resources. And as Karen said, computing is one of them. And computing and data, of course, is the other one. What we can be sure about is that given today's mathematics, and I'm intentionally using the word mathematics, I'll come back to this later. Given today's mathematics, we cannot keep increasing the size of our models in the speed we have been doing in the past couple of years. You cannot go up 1,000 times more because we don't have the computing power to begin with. Now, of course, this limits how far we can go with these models and limits how much differentiation there will eventually be between different companies and tools, given this constraint that everybody has. And that's important to keep that in mind. Computing is a constraint. Having said this, mathematics is always coming to save the world, as we all know. I was in an interesting discussion for a project with actually my PhD advisor in MIT a couple of weeks ago about how to develop new optimization training algorithms for these models that can potentially decrease the cost of computing or the time of computing by a factor of 100 potentially. And that can be a game changer again, or 1,000, who knows, let alone quantum computing later, and let's not even get there. So now to your question, given the resources limited, and mathematics is talent effectively, as Karen said, there will probably be a few models available, a few core models, what people call foundation models, like ChatGPT is one of them. So we will have probably an oligopoly of those models, which will have, of course, an impact on competition. Of course, it will also have an impact on concentrated risk. If all of us use the same, nucleus of AI, then we are all sitting on the same risk in some ways. And who knows what this thing is doing, which is part of the risk discussion. Of course, the next question is, there can always be differentiation, and I'll give you an example. GPT-4, if you go to the website of GPT-4, you will see something which I find is impressive. It actually says explicitly, GPT-4 is aligned with human values. Oh. And that's very important, goes back to what I mentioned before about this technology impacting how we think and behaving in ways that are, according to culture and norms and laws, et cetera, of different regions. And of course, the question then is which values, and that's where we can see quite a lot of differentiation. I'm working on another project with a number of collaborators from industry and academia, including computer science, regarding how to develop so-called AI-aligned products. So this is about product development, what businesses are doing. But whenever you have a product that has AI embedded, it doesn't have to be an AI product. You can have AI embedded, right? Whenever you develop an AI embedded product, how can you ensure that one of the features is that it follows certain values that, of course, they differentiate between regions and cultures, and therefore we can have differentiations at that level, for example, which are new types of differentiations.
Okay, so I really want to ask about what does it mean that it's human value aligned? But before we get to a more in-depth discussion about the values, I do want to go back to Karen about another part of the US-China race, which is that the regulations are quite different for generative AI between the US and China. And we've been reading the Wall Street Journal story recently about China cracking down on people who allegedly created fake videos using generative AI. I mean, what's going on here, and what could the impact be for Chinese companies to have such strict regulations versus other places in the world?
Yeah, I think actually, I don't know, oftentimes when I'm in conversations about regulation on AI, I think it's actually a common misconception that China is not regulating AI. And in fact, as you say, China's actually leading a lot of the AI regulation and passing more AI regulation than any other major jurisdiction right now. In January, there was a major regulation passed called the Deep Synthesis regulation that was, China has this top internet body that's called the CAC, Cyberspace Administration of China. They're the ones that kind of maintain the quality of the internet in China, and are also the ones that are implementing the firewall and so on. But they basically said in those regulations, and then again in April with rules that kind of updated it for generative AI more broadly, that it's prohibited to use AI generated tools for spreading fake news. And on the flip side, also, like any service that provides AI generated tools needs to prominently label those generations to say that they are generated by AI rather than by humans. And this is sort of like a really interesting sweet and sour kind of mix in the regulation, in that when you based on like global international standards, prominently labeling outputs is like a really positive thing that people are starting to coalesce around, is one of the best ways that we can actually start making sure that these tools aren't, massively spreading misinformation and not confusing the public. But on the other hand, by explicitly saying that these tools should not be allowed to produce fake news, you kind of give an extremely broadly defined power to the government to decide what is fake news, and then be able to criminalize things that it just simply doesn't like. And so we're starting to see examples of this regime in China starting to take effect. And that is why we're seeing certain cases in which people are actually being detained now in China for generating misinformation. In this instance, there was one instance in which a user basically allegedly used ChatGPT to generate fake news about a train crash. And in this case, I think it would sort of be globally agreed upon that it was fake news, like there was no train crash. And
so there was no train crash, but this person generated a video about it and I put it up on social media or something?
It was a text.
Okay. All right. Okay.
That said that there was a train crash. There was another instance in which someone else, I think, used a tool to then generate a fake news article as well about some kind of fight that broke out in a bar with like a man abusing his wife. Both of these like articles are kind of sensitive topics. First of all, they did not happen. Second of all, they kind of reflect events that actually did happen in China and were like hot button issues when they happened. And so in the first instance, the man was detained. I don't remember whether or not in the second instance, the police found that person, but these are sort of like globally the first examples of people being criminalized for using these tools in ways that are deemed as nefarious. And one of the concerns that I think companies within China have is, how is this going, like this, definitely there's the huge compliance burden that has been created from these types of regulations. Like they need to be a lot more careful about making sure that they have all of these guardrails in place within their generative AI tools. Like Baidu is developing sort of a ChatGPT equivalent called ErnieBot, and ErnieBot needs to, like, ChatGPT could spew some nonsense and there would be no sort of penalty for that, at least in the US context. But if ErnieBot were to spew some nonsense that were sensitive, or even more so, like the Communist Party felt undermined its legitimacy, that would become like a really, really big deal. So the question I think that people have is whether or not this kind of like compliance burden or regulatory burden is going to slow down the Chinese industry's ability to develop these tools and keep up with US development of these tools sufficiently such that it would just kind of make it really, really hard for China to ever catch up to the US.
Because there's so many regulations.
Because there's so many regulations. But on the other hand, because China is one of the first places to implement certain rules that actually are globally considered like best practice, like this labeling thing, it's also a case study in kind of analyzing whether or not these things work. So like these companies in China are starting to have all of their outputs be labeled, and those are some of the first AI tools in the world that have implemented a feature that other jurisdictions are talking about requiring. And it is a case study for people to observe about whether or not this could actually work. And if Chinese companies end up ultimately not still being able to innovate quite quickly and still being able to advance quite quickly, I think it would also undermine the argument that regulation is a slowdown effect, and there would be a lot more willingness, hopefully, to then regulate in other environments in a way that actually protects users and the general public from these kinds of harms or risks of generative AI tools.
So by labeling, you mean that labeling whether something was generated by AI or humans?
Exactly.
And making
Well,
that
they
distinction.
wouldn't label whether something was generated by humans, but they would
Right.
label that it was an AI generated photo. So we've seen like that viral photo of Pope Francis wearing a Balenciaga coat that initially people thought genuinely was like a real photo under
Wow, the
Chinese
Pope is
law. Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe not hip, but people were, accusing him of, he has this huge image as the man of the people, and now he's wearing this like extremely expensive branded coat.
Yeah.
But under Chinese law, that the service would have had to inject some kind of either a watermark that isn't necessarily visible to a user directly, but is visible to the platforms that the image is being shared on, or a literal label on the thing that says, generated by AI, so that people know that it's fake from the beginning.
Okay. Now it's really interesting that you are talking about this labeling thing. And Theos, I want to go to you about this labeling. There was an audience question actually about Yuval Noah Harari warning about the impact that generative AI could have. And, he was saying that perhaps there should be mandatory labeling whether something is produced by human or AI. And Karen, that sounds like that is exactly what's already happening in China. Theos, my question to you is, what do you think of this labeling? I mean, China is starting to do it. Should other countries do this too? What do you think?
So first of all, let's see how practical it is to begin with. But before I go there, I want to double down again on something that's important for the audience to understand. China has sometimes a lot more regulations than the rest of the world thinks. This is very important. Having said this, for those of you interested, we are writing a series of articles with my colleague Ludo van der Heyden on what we call good tech, for lack of a better word. One of the latest pieces is about the importance of regulatory harmonization, which cannot happen without values harmonization. Because regulation is nothing else but part of governance, of course. There are many other things. You mentioned the Communist Party, and I try to stay away from this discussion, although that's probably one of the big elephants on the planet in many ways, much like every other political system, of course. So the question is, how can we ensure that the regulations not only are implemented correctly, because one thing to have a regulation, the other to implement it, and that depends on, quote unquote, the values and the ways to go around it. So I'm going to your point. People will find ways to go around all those things, much like people found ways to go around financial regulations. There is nothing new here, right? So it's not obvious some of those things will be practical. And a lot of it has to do with values and, of course, continuous refinement of the regulation. So it's a good starting point, what this labeling. I'll be surprised if it turns out to be like the silver bullet. Anyway, there is no silver bullet. And we may need other solutions around this. One more thing, and sorry, I go back to that because I think that's really important. I was in a discussion with a collaborator of mine from China, and I think it's important we all work together on projects because that's how we learn from each other. And I asked a specific question, going back to what, Karen, you said a little bit before about ChatGPT and potentially generating things which are not particularly friendly to the party or other kind of risks, right? And I asked, why did China ban ChatGPT? Because that's all I was reading in Reuters and Financial Times, I don't know, the Wall Street Journal probably, I'm not sure. And his answer was amazing. His answer was, China did not ban ChatGPT because my understanding was that because of lack of control of the narrative, which is a little bit what Harari says. Once you lose control of the narrative because ChatGPT can say whatever, how do you manage that as a political party or as a country or as a company or as an individual? That's what I thought. And he said, China did not ban ChatGPT. The US banned ChatGPT. I was shocked, mostly because I felt everybody's living on a bubble, including ourselves. And of course, the question is,
just to clarify, Theos, so it's the OpenAI does not allow Chinese users to use ChatGPT. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which the Wall Street Journal did accurately report. Just gonna
great.
throw that out there.
Sorry, perfect. Very nice. Probably thanks to you too, which is great work. But this to me raises an alarm about A, common understanding between different regions, right? And B, how to align on all those things. And then, of course, see how to solve the problems. And the problems, part of the solution can be labeling, but as I said, this is probably not a silver bullet. Part of the solution can be putting in place processes of, as we do online. Online, we already do so-called content moderation processes. And we have European regulations, which I personally like very much in this case, the Digital Services Act, that gives you specific fair process, transparent, fair process management of content online, moderation of content online. So we need to put in place fair and transparent processes. Transparency is key here. Labeling can help, but it will not be enough.
Okay.
I want to add to that point that like labeling is not enough. I completely agree that when thinking about solutions for how to make sure that we actually get the benefits out of this technology, but don't experience the harms of it, that there needs to be an interlocking system of regulations or mechanisms that will have to work together. And a few years ago, so generative AI, we talk about it now as like a new thing. Actually, there were many technologies before that you could today categorize as generative AI that no one was really calling generative AI then. One of them being AI generated voice. So that has been around for longer than ChatGPT. And there were already a lot of policy proposals and discussions around how to make sure that something like AI generated voice can't be used for increasing spam calls or fraud. Like there was already a few years ago, like a story in which an employee accidentally was defrauded in transferring hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of dollars potentially to who he thought was the CEO of a company, asking like, please transfer this money because I need to get this whatever. And it was because he thought in this phone call with the voice of the CEO telling him that this was like what was happening. So this has been happening like before ChatGPT, before this generative AI craze. And there was a lot of discussion around what do we do in this kind of scenario. And one of them is, okay, we need to have the tool makers label things, but also there are many other proposals that would need to kind of continue reinforcing this. There was like one AI generated voice toolmaker, for example, that also designed their tool to make sure that it's quite difficult to just randomly have anyone generate anyone's voice without their consent. So they specifically don't start generating someone's voice unless they get an audio clip of them speaking a very specific paragraph of text, which means that then the only thing that the user can do is actually ask permission of that person and get that person to speak that paragraph of text before the thing starts creating like an AI synthetic version of that voice. So there's like all of these like feature tricks that you can use to kind of increase the barrier of someone generating another person's voice without their consent. Then you have the labeling. Then there were these proposals around platforms also coordinating with the tool makers. Like if the tool maker has injects a watermark or some kind of fingerprint into these AI generated media, they should be coordinating with platforms like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok to tell them what the watermark is. So then those platforms know to look for that specific signature, which becomes then a lot less computationally expensive. You're just looking for that like hidden marker. And then you can add the label on Twitter saying, okay, this is a generated photo. And then on top of that, you would then need regulation that requires all of the players in this space to do all of these things and be working together. So it kind of, that case study of how people were thinking about AI generated voice already kind of is actually the blueprint for what like the EU AI Act, for example, is trying to now implement in practice and what other regulatory efforts are trying to implement. And it shows this kind of, you need many, many layers of checks and balances in the system for something to get closer to working and protecting us from these harms.
Wow, that sounds awfully complicated though. I mean, we talked about labeling, we talked about IP as well. Karen, can you tell me about what are the lawsuits that are going on now that target companies over data used? And, you know, who owns it gets down to who owns the voice, who owns the data, right?
Yeah.
What's the conversation going on there right now?
Yeah, so basically there's been a series of lawsuits that have targeted towards generative AI companies, where the people that are suing the companies are basically alleging that their data was stolen in training these systems. So there's been a class action lawsuit from artists that are suing Stability AI and Midjourney, which are AI generation tools. There's been a class action lawsuit from coders that are saying that OpenAI, Microsoft, and GitHub stole their data from GitHub. Even though it was open source code that they put out in the world, their argument is that they never gave permission to have their code kind of sucked up to then create these code generation systems that could put them out of work. Same with the artists, like the artists are like, yes, our photos were out on the internet, but we never gave permission to have these systems created that could put us out of work. And then there's also a lawsuit, I think that where Getty Images is also suing Stability AI, saying that they accessed some images without paying for Getty Images, which has a subscriber model. And in all of these lawsuits, sort of like the underlying theme is this question of like who actually owns the data and what's considered fair use on data that exists on the internet. So like the AI companies, they argue that when you're using data to train a system, it is fair use because the outputs from that system are then fundamentally different.
That's a lot of data to call fair use.
Right. And then for the artists, for coders, for other people that are suing these companies, their argument is that it's actually not fundamentally different because these systems are just super pattern recognition matchers and they're just spitting out the same pattern. So actually all of the outputs are derivative of the data that it was trained on. And in IP law, like if your idea is derivative of another idea, like you should be paying some kind of licensing fee to the original person, the original creator. So
just for full disclosure, it looks like our parent company News Corp and its CEO Robert Thompson is also of that was saying that AI needs to pay us for the content that is being used. So
well, there's another thought floating around.
Okay.
Which is that these technologies may somehow paradoxically end up making the internet and data less open, simply because we may put in place, pricing mechanism where you can only use the data to train your AI if you pay me. So that will basically put firewall around data, which will make the internet less open, which is potentially a side effect which we don't wish to have. And on the other hand, there is just to add a little bit on the detection side and also on the IP side to some extent. Of course, I'm not an IP lawyer, and I don't think the law is yet ready. I think it will take time for the law to be ready. So we have to think about what kind of restrictions we can put in place for now, and that's of course going to be an ongoing process. However, what we can do in general, and there is another paradox. So the first paradox is that this technology may make the internet less open. The second paradox is that it may be the case that actually strong AI, let me say stronger AI, will actually help us solve lots of these problems we're discussing. It's a little bit counterintuitive that, in fact, to manage the risks in general, IP or other risks also, we may actually need to have better AI to actually detect, to do the job better in terms of identifying differences, identifying innovations, identifying violations, identifying whatever, right?
So AI to regulate AI.
It will play a role of it. To begin with, again, online content moderation, there is already huge usage of AI detection tools that detect illegal content. So
I think the big kind of challenge that I see with that approach is that the companies that would be developing these like stronger AI tools are going to be the same companies that are benefiting from from designing those AI tools to not detect any kind of IP theft, because it is only a few players now that have the resources to develop these kinds of tools. So I don't really see in the current political economy of AI that we have that really being actually an effective regulatory mechanism. It's more like we would just enhance self-regulation, which I don't really think works with a veneer of sophistication because of AI tools.
Yeah, I think it's just, there's no silver bullet. It's a portfolio of activities that need to be put in place including some of that. And that's very important to realize. Like, and it will take us time also, right? So.
Well, we have a huge number of audience questions, including the one on regulation and danger. Theos, I want to go to you. There's a question from Pablo about how can governments actually regulate AI development? And you mentioned AI, regulating AI or helping to regulate AI. Ludo asked, how can we handle the massive amount of information generated by AI? There's another question about how do we get through disinformation? So there are all these questions about how can it be regulated?
Yeah, thanks.
What
So
do
first
you
of
think?
all, nobody knows. So let me make sure that I set expectations right. However, here are a couple of interesting points. First of all, in some applications, we may end up getting quote unquote regulation because of existing structures. Let me give you an example, right? Let's say that malpractice insurance does not pay, does not reimburse in case a doctor or a professional in general, let's say, uses these technologies in ways which are not compliant with something. Well, malpractice insurance companies and general insurance may actually play a regulatory role in this space eventually and be the de facto practical regulation. So there is it's not just regulation, it's also other mechanisms we have, market mechanisms, insurance mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first thing. Second thing is that what's important is, again, I'm going back to transparency and fair process, which is at the core of the Digital Services Act regulation and probably will be at the core of AI Act. For example, we have to have processes in place to ensure we collectively identify, report, and fix potential issues AI may lead to, like what people call nowadays AI incidents. And we have to put in place processes for identifying and reporting and managing AI incidents collectively, which, by the way, this is not something new, because we talk about AI, but basically this is technology incidents, right? The technology for which we know very well how to manage the incidents is drugs for pharmaceuticals. And there's a whole field there. I'm working on this topic these days on an article, a whole field there, which is called pharmacovigilance, which we know for decades how to use in order to understand side effects of drugs. We are working on something which we call algorithmovigilance. Same idea. How can we put in place processes to collectively kind of manage potential AI incidents of whatever type? So all in all, A, it's not just regulation. There are other mechanisms. B, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of lessons from other fields in pharmaceutical, also financial sector, anti-money laundering kind of processes, etc. And C, it's important to of course always keep in mind the basic principles, which is around transparency and fair process, of course, which I'm sure if Ludo is a Ludo, I assume it is, would like the answer. Now, in terms of managing the volume of the content, that's a very good question. We are running in San Francisco in a few weeks a so-called trust and safety hackathon with a number of people from large platforms. And one of the questions is how can we use AI to manage basically content online or generally content generated, probably also offline, more effectively. And of course, one of the challenges, and the challenge that also platforms are kind of panicking with, is how do we manage the volume of potentially infinite volume generated? And again, Karen mentioned about watermarks, which can work in some cases, not in others. For example, there is no way to put a watermark behind text generated by ChatGPT. I can just copy it, paste it somewhere else and post it, right? Who knows, right? Maybe the same with images. I don't know if I can take a screenshot or something. Maybe the watermark is still there. Anyway, point is that we need to develop technologies also to manage the volume in fair and transparent processes again. But no, we are not there yet by any means.
Okay, so there's no real, we don't know yet is sort of, right? We don't know. Karen, do you agree?
Some glimpses. We have some glimpses from different areas also, and we have some principles and some technologies, but we are definitely not there, I think. Maybe
yeah, I think it's there are a lot of blueprints and there are a lot of proposals, but it really is hard to really tell whether or not those things will be sufficient until they're implemented. And we already see one version of the implementation in China, but we still need to see the effects of that. You know, it was just implemented, and then we would want to see hopefully more implementation so that we can understand really how to refine the regulation.
Okay. All right. You know, Theos, I need to go back to you on something you said earlier on, and it's going to take us back a bit, but there's so many questions on this topic about, you said that generative AI changes how we think. And what exactly did you mean by that? And how is it is it how we think? Is it what we think? What is it that it's changing?
So first of all, in my view, this is by far the biggest risk we run on the planet from AI. That's my view, because whoever controls our minds controls our destiny, put it simply. Now, what does it mean control our mind? Let me give you a scary project, but very exciting project I'm working on with some computer science, an amazing team from MIT, actually. We know that humans, and we know processes, humans can actually follow certain processes and, let me say the word, install false memories in the minds of other humans. I can convince you, both of you, that yesterday you had dinner to a restaurant with a big black dog next to you, even though there was nothing like this. So these are practices we know for many decades and being used. The project we are doing now is how to get generative AI to implant false memories to people. And why we do this? Because we have to understand how this is doable. And hopefully nobody in the audience plans to do this immediately for bad reasons. And I'm saying this carefully here, because we have to understand exactly how these technologies affect our way of thinking, including false memories. I'm really excited by this project, as you can imagine, and we have to understand this fast. Now, having said this, second thing is that you see, it's like at the end, so Lawrence Lessig, a wonderful thinker on the space for many decades now, a legal scholar I think at Harvard now, is writing a lot about the potential need to limit, not allow media, online platforms or anybody to use these technologies during the US election campaign. And my feeling is that the US election campaign will prove to be really, really an important turning point in our discussion, really. And the answer is, for example, we don't know if a generative AI like ChatGPT or whatever interacts with somebody. We really don't understand how, let's say, a ChatGPT which is optimized and is given the instruction in quotes to convince somebody to vote for a certain party. We really don't understand. We really don't understand the capabilities the technology can have in convincing people and even playing with quote unquote their emotions to do this. This is not just an advertisement. This is an interactive session with a therapist, more or less. So there is all in all to say is that we are very early in understanding how this works. We are very early in understanding how this can impact our narratives and our memories and our beliefs and our identity eventually. We already have signs, by the way, that even beyond AI, even before the generative AI, social media and the way recommender algorithms have been suggesting content to people. It's not generating content, it's suggesting existing content, which is not too far, has been playing an important role in potentially polarizing certain communities. So this will only get worse.
I see. So really playing with emotions and also, making me believe that I had dinner at a restaurant last night where there was a big black dog. Okay. Wow. Okay. I want to go to another question for Karen. This is from Vim. Now, you talked about competition to produce the new tools and how extreme and cutthroat the competition was. Do you think it's going to be a winner takes all market where the big companies are going to have all the advantage? And Theos, I think you mentioned oligopoly as well, or is it going to be lots of players always competing, or is there going to be a clear winner?
I think the trend right now shows that it would ultimately be an oligopoly for the most cutting edge tools. So we are seeing there are a lot of open source efforts. There are a lot of startups that are building sort of similar tools to ChatGPT, but like when based on like industry insiders, the general understanding is that those are not the most cutting edge. They don't have the best capabilities. And the reason why is because, going back to what I was saying, that these technologies, generative AI technologies, just require an enormous amount of resources to develop. Not just financial resources, the literal hardware, the chips, the computer chips that you need to train these systems. There's a global shortage right now because of generative AI. Even OpenAI is struggling to make sure that they have enough chips to power ChatGPT for every time a user asks ChatGPT a question. And that physical constraint is not something that we can really break out of at the moment, unless we have sort of a really dramatic change in another paradigm shift. As Theos mentioned, like there is some research that's trying to make these develop systems that are just as capable with less resources. But at the moment, based on the trajectory of the last 5 to 10 years of AI research, the trend has been that these systems become more and more capable because there is more and more data behind them, and there are more and more computer chips that these companies are using to facilitate all of the mathematical computation that is happening to create these systems. And so you can't really get out of that. If we're talking about physical resource constraints, you can't really get out of that. There's a finite amount of computer chips in the world. There's like one company that reliably produces the most cutting edge AI chips called TSMC, that's based in Taiwan. And there's like one major company that is producing those cutting edge chips that everyone wants to use. That's the American company, NVIDIA. So there's just a lot of bottlenecks to producing this literal hardware that is necessary for producing these systems. And unless we get around that kind of situation, we're going to be in an oligopoly situation for a long time.
So it looks like a free market, but it could be in.
2 points I think interesting to note. Sorry to interrupt. 2 points interesting to note. First of all, one idea that I've seen floating is that you can use constraints on computing power, on computation to regulate AI and limit it. So computation, being a core resource, can be limited, for example, and then you're not allowed to build something bigger. Second thing is that China, as we know, is of course already developing its own ecosystem of semiconductors, given all the constraints. And that will, of course, play out in, we don't know in what ways going forward. And the next question, of course, is it's not just one country. You may need a global supply chain / ecosystem, you know, across multiple countries. You mentioned NVIDIA and TSMC, but it's also ASML, et cetera, right? So how the ecosystems of chips generation, chip development evolve over time will impact which countries will be ahead and which companies will be ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Now, I want to do one last poll before we close, and we're almost out of time, but I want to ask the same question that we asked at the very beginning to the audience, which is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of generative AI? After hearing all this discussion, risks, regulation, competition, watermarks, how you think the black dog in the restaurant, all of that. How do you think about the future of generative AI? Okay, so we have, so people are still optimistic, though perhaps a little less than before, but still predominantly optimistic about the future of generative AI. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for doing this. And we're running out of time here. So I wish we could go on for another whole hour on this topic. There is so much more to discuss. But I want to close by saying thank you to our panelists, Theos and Karen. And thank you to all of you for participating in this discussion and all these questions that came in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.